History is full of screams that were never written down. Some men were laughed at, beaten, hunted like animals until the moment they stopped running. Tonight's story is not about mercy. It's about what happens when cruelty pushes a human being past fear and turns him into something far more dangerous. He had been hunted for so long that being hunted no longer felt like danger, it felt like routine, the same way hunger felt routine, the same way pain settled into the bones and never truly left. His name had been taken early, replaced by whistles, insults, numbers, shouted across fields and roads, and over time, even those sounds blurred together into something distant. To the men who chased him, he was not a person moving through the world, he was a thing that ran, a shadow to be cornered, a problem to be solved with rope and iron. They never asked who he had been before the chains, before the scars layered themselves like old bark over skin. He had once known the weight of a full breath taken without fear, once known the sound of his own laughter before it was beaten out of him. That version of him felt like a story told by someone else, something half-remembered in dreams that dissolved by morning. What remained was a body trained to endure and a mind trained to observe, to remember paths, sounds, patterns, and silences. Every failed escape taught him something new. Every capture sharpened his awareness of the men who claimed to own him. He learned how they drank, how they joked, how they grew careless when they thought themselves superior. The slave hunters saw only what they wanted to see, a thin frame, a slow limp from an old injury, eyes that rarely met theirs. They mistook restraint for weakness and silence for emptiness. When they mocked him, they did it loudly, as if cruelty needed an audience to feel real. They laughed at the way his shoulders hunched, at how he flinched when dogs barked, at how he followed orders without resistance. In their minds, resistance was loud and obvious, fists raised, curses shouted, desperate runs through open fields. They never considered that resistance could be quiet, patient, waiting. Each hunt stripped something away from him, but it also left something behind. Rage does not always explode in the moment it is born. Sometimes it settles, heavy and slow, sinking deep where it cannot be seen. He carried it with him as he walked, as he worked, as he slept in short, broken intervals. It warmed him in the cold and kept him awake in the dark. It whispered reminders of every face that had grinned while he bled, every boot that pressed him into the dirt while men argued about his price. The world around him taught him what mattered to his hunters. Their weapons leaned against walls when they felt safe. Their dogs were fed first, trusted more than men like him. Their fires burned late into the night, careless sparks jumping into dry grass while laughter drowned out caution. They believed fear lived only in the bodies they controlled, not in their own. That belief made them sloppy. That belief made them blind. He watched everything. The routes they took between towns, the places where the road narrowed and the trees closed in, the moments when even armed men grew tired and distracted. Knowledge became his only possession, and he guarded it fiercely. While they mocked him, he measured them. While they insulted him, he counted steps and seconds. While they slept, he replayed every detail until it was etched into him more deeply than any scar. Being treated as less than human changed the way he saw the world. If he was already considered dead, already erased, then the rules that bound other men did not apply to him anymore. Fear of punishment lost its power when punishment had been constant. Pain lost its threat when pain was guaranteed. What replaced those fears was something colder, more focused. A sense that the world owed him nothing and that he owed the world even less. The hunters never noticed the shift because it did not look dramatic. There was no sudden defiance, no explosive outburst, just a steadiness in his movements, a calm that did not belong to someone who believed he would live long. They mistook it for submission, congratulated themselves on how completely he had been broken. In truth, he had stopped seeing them as masters or captors and started seeing them as obstacles, temporary ones. Every mockery added weight to a future moment they could not imagine. Every joke sharpened his resolve. They laughed because laughter made them feel powerful, but power built on cruelty has a way of rotting from the inside. He understood that long before they ever did. He understood that the world they ruled depended on everyone else believing in their strength, and belief is fragile when tested in the dark. By the time they realized he was no longer afraid, it was already too late to matter, because a man who has accepted the worst no longer hesitates, no longer bargains with hope, no longer waits for permission, and moves through the shadows with a purpose that does not announce itself, carrying the memory of every hunt, every chain, every laugh, and every moment he was treated as less than human, step by step, breath by breath, closer to the point where endurance turns into something far more dangerous. The laughter came easily to them, rolling out of their mouths as naturally as smoke from a fire, because cruelty had become entertainment and dominance had turned into a kind of sport. They laughed when the dog snapped too close to his legs, laughed when he stumbled on uneven ground, laughed when the chain around his wrists cut into skin already raw. To them, mockery was proof of control, a way to remind themselves and each other that the world bent in their favor. Every joke was meant to shrink him, to press him smaller and smaller until nothing recognizable remained. They spoke about him as if he could not understand, even when he stood only a few steps away. Words like cargo and animal and property were thrown around casually, stripped of weight by repetition. They compared him to others they had caught, ranking scars, strength, obedience, as if discussing horses or tools. The sound of their voices blended with the creak of leather and the jingle of metal, forming a soundtrack that followed him everywhere. Even when they were not looking at him, he felt their eyes, felt the constant judgment that said he was less and always would be. Their cruelty was rarely quiet. It needed witnesses. Around campfires, they reenacted captures, exaggerating resistance, turning fear into comedy. One would mimic a pleading voice, another would imitate a desperate run, and the rest would howl with laughter, slapping knees and passing bottles. They believed humiliation was as effective as chains, maybe even more so. If a man could be convinced he was ridiculous, then he would never believe he could be dangerous. They did not see the way his jaw tightened when they laughed, the way his breathing slowed, the way his eyes fixed on details rather than faces. They mistook stillness for surrender. They thought silence meant absence, that nothing was happening behind his eyes. Their mockery grew bolder because there were no consequences, no immediate retaliation to remind them that they were playing with something alive. The absence of resistance fed their confidence like fuel on a flame. Sometimes they pushed him to perform his own humiliation, to dance awkwardly with chains on his ankles, to repeat insults they had given him, to bow his head exaggeratedly when addressed. Each demand was met with compliance, and each compliance deepened their belief that he was hollowed out completely. They did not understand that every forced gesture etched itself into his memory with perfect clarity, becoming a catalogue of faces, voices, and habits. Cruelty became routine, routine became boredom, and boredom led them to invent new ways to amuse themselves. They argued over who could frighten him more, who could make him flinch the hardest. They tested him with sudden shouts, with the snap of a whip just short of skin, with dogs brought close enough that hot breath brushed his legs. When he did not react the way they wanted, when fear did not spill out dramatically, they grew irritated and tried harder, mistaking restraint for stubbornness. In their minds, power was proven by reaction. A scream, a tear, a desperate plea, these were trophies. The fact that he denied them those trophies confused and angered them, but not enough to make them cautious. They blamed his body, his supposed dullness, his injuries, anything but the possibility that he was choosing not to give them what they wanted. To admit that would have meant admitting that something within him remained untouched. They never spoke to him as an equal, never even as a man. Orders were barked, names replaced with whistles or numbers. If he failed to respond instantly, mockery followed, accusations of stupidity or laziness. They enjoyed reducing him to a caricature because it made their own roles clearer. Hunters needed prey, masters needed submission. Without those roles, their identity would have cracked. What they could not grasp was how their laughter echoed long after it faded, how it replayed itself in the dark, sharpening instead of dulling. How every cruel imitation taught him their rhythms, their timing, the moments when attention drifted. Their jokes revealed more than they intended, exposing rivalries among themselves, resentments, habits of drinking too much, sleeping too deeply, trusting the wrong man at the wrong time. They believed mockery was harmless compared to physical punishment, that words left no marks. But words accumulated, heavy and corrosive, dissolving fear and replacing it with something denser. He stopped hearing them as insults and started hearing them as confirmation that they did not see him, truly see him, and that blindness wrapped around them like a cloak. By the time the laughter no longer made his pulse race, By the time the insults felt distant and oddly irrelevant, the balance had already shifted. They were still laughing, still performing their cruelty for one another, still convinced that the world they ruled was solid and unchanging, unaware that every joke was loosening a brick, every moment of mockery widening a crack, every careless burst of laughter echoing forward toward a silence they could not yet imagine, a silence waiting just beyond the edge of their firelight, growing heavier, closer, and far less forgiving. There is a moment when fear stops screaming and starts listening, a moment so quiet it almost feels like relief. For him, that moment did not arrive with a single blow or a single insult, but with the slow realization that nothing new could be taken from him. Hunger had already hollowed him out, pain had already mapped his body, humiliation had already stripped away the parts of him that once cared how he was seen. When the worst becomes familiar, it loses its power to threaten, and what replaces it is not courage but clarity. He began to notice that his heart no longer raced when the dogs barked. The sound still cut through the air, still raised hairs on his skin, but it no longer scattered his thoughts. Instead, it sharpened them. He could tell which dog was closest by the pitch of its growl, which handler held the leash by the way the chain rattled. Fear had once flooded his senses until everything blurred, but now it narrowed his focus, turning the world into a series of details that mattered. The breaking point was not loud. There was no dramatic defiance, no shouted vow, no sudden violence. It was a quiet, internal shift, like something heavy settling into place. He understood, finally, that obedience had not saved him, that silence had not spared him, that endurance alone would only keep him alive long enough to suffer again. The realization did not bring panic, it brought a strange calm. If suffering was guaranteed, then the rules designed to avoid it no longer applied. Rage entered him slowly, not as fire, but as heat stored beneath the skin. It did not demand immediate release. It waited. It organized itself. Every memory of laughter, every careless insult, every moment of being displayed like an object lined up neatly inside him. Rage stopped being an emotion and became a resource, something to draw from rather than something to be consumed by. He stopped measuring his days by pain and started measuring them by opportunity. He watched the hunters move, listened to their voices, noted when they grew tired, when arrogance softened their edges. He noticed how confidence made them predictable. They took the same paths, trusted the same habits, assumed the same outcomes. They believed the world had already decided who they were and who he was, and that belief shaped every choice they made. Inside him, something hardened. Pity for himself dissolved first. Then hope, the kind that waits for mercy from others, faded with it. What remained was a sharp sense of purpose that did not need comfort or reassurance. He did not imagine escape as freedom anymore. He imagined it as balance, as correction, as a force answering another force. That thought did not frighten him, it steadied him. The hunters mistook this steadiness for emptiness. They thought he had been drained of everything that made a man dangerous. They did not understand that danger does not always announce itself with noise and chaos. Sometimes it grows in silence, learning patience, learning restraint, learning how to strike only when it matters. His stillness became his shield, his compliance, his camouflage. When they hurt him, he no longer asked why. Questions had answers once, but answers did not change anything. Instead, he asked how they held their weapons, how they positioned themselves when relaxed, how they spoke when they thought no one important was listening. Every act of cruelty taught him something about their weaknesses, about the blind spots that cruelty creates in those who wield it too often. The fear that once lived in his chest moved outward. It no longer belonged to him alone. It became something he could imagine placing into others, something transferable. The idea did not feel monstrous to him. It felt logical. Fear had shaped his life completely without his consent. Now he understood its mechanics well enough to use it deliberately. There were nights when he lay awake staring into darkness, replaying moments not with despair, but with calculation. If this happened, then that would follow. If this man reacted this way, then another would respond differently. His mind rehearsed scenarios with the same discipline his body had been forced to learn in labor. Planning became a form of resistance that no one could see or punish. The point of no return arrived without ceremony. He realized he no longer imagined a future where they existed unchanged. The thought of their continued laughter felt wrong, unfinished, like a sentence cut off before meaning. That realization did not bring joy or sorrow. It brought certainty. He understood then that whatever happened next, whether he survived it or not, he would not return to the state they expected of him. He was no longer a man waiting to be broken, no longer a body reacting to commands and pain. He had crossed into something quieter and far more dangerous, a state where fear had been stripped of its authority and rage had been disciplined into purpose, where every breath carried intention and every memory sharpened resolve, moving him steadily toward a moment the hunters could not see coming, a moment built from silence, patience, and the absolute acceptance that the world as they knew it was already ending. Plans rarely arrive fully formed. They emerge slowly, shaped by observation, adjusted by memory, refined by repetition. For him, the plan was not a single idea, but a collection of moments stitched together by patience. It grew in the spaces where no one looked, in the pauses between orders, in the quiet stretches of night when even cruelty slept. Darkness became an ally, not because it hid him, but because it revealed others as they truly were when they believed themselves unseen. Silence was the first tool he mastered. He learned how to move without announcing himself, how to shift weight so the ground did not betray him, how to breathe shallowly when tension thickened the air. Silence was not emptiness, it was information. In the absence of noise, every careless sound stood out sharply. A boot scraping stone, a flask knocked over, a laugh cut short by sleep. These sounds mapped the night more clearly than daylight ever could. He memorized the routines they trusted too much. Fires built in the same places, weapons leaned against the same trees, dogs tied with knots that assumed no one watching would know how to undo them. Confidence repeated itself until it became predictable. They believed unpredictability belonged only to fear, not realizing how fearlessness simplifies choices. Once fear no longer clouded his thinking, patterns appeared everywhere. The plan did not rely on strength. Strength was unreliable, too easily broken. It relied on timing, on waiting until fatigue softened reactions and arrogance dulled caution. He understood that men who believed themselves powerful often neglected the small details, assuming nothing beneath them could reach high enough to matter. That assumption wrapped around them like a blindfold. He rehearsed everything in his mind long before it ever touched reality. He imagined routes through trees, counted steps between light and shadow, calculated how long it took for sound to travel when the night air was still. He considered what would happen if something went wrong, if someone woke too early, if a dog barked too loudly. Each possibility had an answer, not because he expected perfection, but because he expected chaos and prepared for it. Darkness changed the shape of the world. It flattened distance, hid depth, turned familiar places into uncertain terrain. Where they saw danger in the dark, he saw opportunity. He had lived too long inside uncertainty to fear it. The night did not judge him or mock him, it simply existed, and he learned to exist within it. He noticed how fire both comforted and blinded them. Flames drew their eyes, fixed their attention, made shadows behind them deeper and easier to move through. Firelight gave them a sense of control, the illusion that what they could see was all there was. He understood how easily that illusion could be turned against them. Sparks jumped farther than expected. Dry ground caught quickly. Smoke confused direction and muffled sound. The plan was never spoken aloud, not even in whispers. Words could betray intention. Thought was safer. Thought left no trail. While they joked and argued, he listened, collecting fragments that revealed rivalries and resentments. He learned who trusted whom, who disliked whom, who would hesitate if something went wrong. People under pressure rarely act as a single force. They fracture along lines that already exist. Patience tested him more than pain ever had. Waiting required restraint, and restraint demanded control. There were moments when action felt close enough to taste, when instinct urged him to move too soon. He resisted. Acting too early would only restore the balance they depended on. The plan needed them relaxed, careless, certain. It needed their laughter uninterrupted, their confidence intact. He adjusted details constantly. A shifted camp, a new guard rotation, a change in weather. Flexibility mattered more than precision. He did not need everything to go exactly right. He needed only one opening wide enough to slip through. From there, momentum would do the rest. The idea of survival transformed as the plan grew. Survival was no longer about enduring another day under their control. It became about deciding when endurance ended. That decision brought clarity, not desperation. He accepted the cost without flinching, because cost had followed him his entire life. What changed was who would pay it. He imagined the moment not with excitement, but with calm attention. The smell of smoke, the sudden confusion, voices rising, overlapping, losing structure. Darkness no longer empty, but full of movement and consequence. He did not imagine faces twisted in fear with satisfaction or hatred. He imagined silence afterward, the kind that settles when a place is changed permanently. By the time the plan was complete, it no longer felt like revenge. It felt like gravity, inevitable once set in motion. Everything they had done had contributed to it. Every insult, every careless habit, every moment they underestimated what lived behind his quiet. The night waited, heavy and patient, holding space for what was about to unfold, a darkness ready to receive fire, footsteps, and the collapse of certainty that had taken so long to build. Night did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, thinning the edges of the world until shapes softened and distances lied. The camp settled into its familiar rhythm, the kind that comes from men who believe tomorrow will look exactly like today. Laughter rose and fell. Boots were kicked off. Weapons were leaned where hands could find them in the dark without thought. Firelight pulsed gently, throwing long shadows that stretched and retreated like breathing things. He moved when the moment stopped feeling like a moment and started feeling like a current. Not rushed, not hesitant. Just forward. The night accepted him easily, swallowing the sound of his steps, masking the shift of his weight. Every sense sharpened. The air carried smoke and sweat and the faint metallic tang of iron. He knew where each man slept by the sound of breathing, knew which one snored, which one muttered, which one slept so deeply the world could have ended around him without notice. The dogs were the first problem and the first solution. They were used to obedience, to routine, to the hands that fed them. A loosened knot, a whispered sound shaped like familiarity, and confusion replaced alertness. Chains slid free with barely a whisper. Teeth did not bark. The night held its breath. Fire did the rest. Not as an explosion, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. Dry ground caught quickly, faster than they ever imagined it could. Sparks leapt where no one was watching. Smoke thickened low, blinding eyes before lungs understood what was happening. Shouts broke out unevenly, tangled with coughing and disbelief. Order dissolved into noise. Men stumbled from sleep into chaos, grabbing at shadows, reaching for weapons that were no longer where they expected them to be. Firelight betrayed them now, painting targets where it once gave comfort. Figures ran the wrong way, collided, fell. Commands were shouted but carried no authority. Panic does not listen. He moved through it like something that belonged there, using the confusion rather than fighting it. Every step followed paths he had already walked in his mind 100 times. He did not rush toward faces. He moved around them, through them, letting the night and the fire do the work they had underestimated. The world narrowed to motion and sound and timing. The hunters became what they had always created. Hunted. Their strength meant nothing without coordination. Their weapons meant nothing without calm. The same fear they had wielded so casually now ripped through them without mercy. Eyes darted. Hands shook. Voices cracked. Some ran blindly into darkness they had never learned to read. Flames climbed higher, greedy and uncontrolled. Tents collapsed. Supplies burned. Smoke erased direction, turned the familiar into a maze. Dogs scattered. Horses screamed and broke loose, adding to the chaos. What had been a place of certainty unraveled completely, strand by strand. He did not linger to watch. This was not about spectacle or witnessing suffering. Movement mattered. Momentum mattered. He slipped past the edges of the fire, into the deeper dark beyond it, where the world opened and closed in unfamiliar ways. Behind him, the night roared with heat and confusion, a sound that would carry far and plant fear in places he would never see. Somewhere in that noise, the hunters realized something fundamental had changed. The balance they depended on had shattered. The world no longer bent in their favor. The laughter that once filled the night was gone, replaced by something raw and unstructured. Control had evaporated, leaving only reaction. As distance grew, the sounds blurred, losing shape, turning into a low, indistinct thunder. Smoke drifted upward, marking the place where certainty had burned itself out. The land absorbed the damage without comment, the way it always does. Grass would grow again, trees would stand, the night would return to silence. He kept moving, guided by stars, half hidden by smoke, by instincts sharpened through years of watching and waiting. Every step carried him farther from the person they believed they owned. The world ahead was unknown, but it was no longer defined by chains and laughter and predictable cruelty. Behind him, something old and rotten collapsed in on itself, leaving only ash, scattered footprints, and the lingering understanding that even the most brutal systems depend on blindness, routine, and the dangerous belief that fear always belongs to someone else.